The rope was meant for her neck, a final chilling embrace promised by the dawn. But in the desolate quiet of that final night, a lonely Apache rancher arrived to take her place, rewriting the end of a story everyone thought they already knew. Before we are swept into this tale of dust and desperation, let us know in the comments where you are watching from in the world, and please subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. The cell was a stone lung, and with every breath, Ilara felt it contract around her. The air, thin and cold, tasted of rust and finality. Outside, the town of Redemption was a sleeping beast, its snores a low rumble of wind against the high desert plains. But she knew it wasn't truly asleep. It was waiting for the sun to spill over the jagged horizon, waiting for the gallows in the square to fulfill its purpose, waiting to watch her life be unwritten in a single, brutal moment. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn cot, the splinters of familiar cruelty. This was the end, a conclusion decided not by truth, but by a chorus of whispers that had grown into a verdict. They called her a sinner, a black widow, the woman who had silenced her husband, a man the town had revered as a pillar of the community. They didn't know the man who lived behind closed doors, the man whose love was a brand, whose touch was a cage. They saw only what they wanted to see, a woman who had broken the sacred covenant. A tremor ran through her, not of cold, but of a deep, resonant fear that had been her companion for so long it felt like a part of her own skeleton. She wouldn't cry. She had promised herself that. Tears were a currency she no longer possessed. There was only a hollow space where a future was supposed to be, a void filled with the phantom echo of a slamming door, a shattered plate, and a silence that was far more violent than any scream. The sound of a heavy boot on the wooden planks outside the sheriff's office was a sudden, sharp intrusion into her reverie. It was too early for the priest, too late for a last meal. This sound was different. It was measured, quiet, deliberate. It was the sound of someone who walked the earth without asking its permission. The heavy oak door of the office groaned open, and a new voice, low and calm as a riverbed, cut through the stale air. It wasn't the sheriff's booming baritone or his deputy's nervous stammer. This was a voice that seemed to carry the dust of the plains within it. Ilara pressed her face against the cold iron bars of her cell door. Her world narrowed to the sliver of the office she could see. There, silhouetted against the flickering gas lamp, stood a man she recognized only from a distance. Kyle, the Apache rancher whose land bordered the forgotten edge of the territory. A man who kept to himself with a fierce and silent dignity that the town mistook for arrogance. He was an island in their sea of conformity, a dark shape on the horizon they spoke of in hushed, suspicious tones. Sheriff Miller, a man whose gut preceded him into every room, looked up from his paperwork, his expression a mixture of irritation and surprise. "Can't you read the sign, Cale? Office is closed." Cale didn't move. He stood just inside the doorway, his presence filling the space more completely than 10 of the town's blustering councilmen. His face, etched by sun and sorrow, was unreadable. "I'm not here for business, Sheriff," he said, his voice unchanging. "I'm here to see the prisoner." The sheriff let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's not happening. No visitors, especially not now." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the coming dawn. "It's against the rules." But Cale's gaze was fixed, not on the sheriff, but on the dark hallway that led to the cells. He could feel her there. He could feel her fear like a change in the air pressure. "Rules can be bent," Cale stated, not as a question, but as a simple fact. "I will not cause trouble." There was a long silence, a standoff measured in the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that seemed to be counting down the final seconds of Ilara's life. Sheriff Miller stared at the man, a man he and the rest of the town had long since dismissed as a relic, a ghost from a conquered past. Yet there was a power in his stillness, an unnerving certainty that the sheriff found himself unable to easily dismiss. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced the fog of Ilara's resignation. It wasn't a memory of the trial, or of the final, terrible argument with her husband. It was older, quieter, a summer afternoon, months before the world had shattered. She was in the mercantile, the air thick with the scent of dried beans and salt pork, her husband at her side, his hand a proprietary weight on the small of her back. His voice was a low murmur of instructions, of corrections, each word a tiny invisible chip at her soul. Then, through the grimy window, she had seen him. Kyle. He was across the street, loading supplies onto a pack mule, his movements fluid and efficient. He worked alone, his back to the town, a silent testament to his self-reliance. He was not a part of their world, and he made no effort to be. For a fleeting moment, their eyes had met across that dusty expanse. There was no greeting, no smile. There was only a flicker of mutual recognition, the silent acknowledgement of two people living on the absolute fringe. She was an outcast in her own home, a prisoner in her own marriage. He was an outcast by birth, a stranger in the land of his ancestors. In that single shared glance, she had felt a strange, inexplicable kinship, a sense of being seen not as Mrs. Abraham Finch, but as a person gasping for air. The memory dissolved, leaving the bitter taste of the present in her mouth. Her husband was dead, and the man who had looked at her with understanding from across the street was now standing just a few feet away, demanding to see her on the eve of her execution. What could he possibly want? The sheriff's heavy sigh was a sound of reluctant defeat. He heaved himself out of his chair, grabbing the ring of keys from a hook on the wall. 5 minutes, he grumbled, his voice thick with resentment. And that's it. Don't make me regret this. He led Kyle down the short, dark corridor, the jangling of the keys a discordant symphony against the suffocating silence. The key turned in the lock, the sound deafeningly loud in the small space. The cell door swung inward, and Cale stepped inside, the sheriff waiting impatiently in the hall. The small cell suddenly felt even smaller, crowded with the weight of 2 lifetimes of unspoken pain. Cale stood before her, his tall frame eclipsing the weak lamplight from the hall. He smelled of sagebrush and leather, of the open spaces she would never see again. His face, in the dimness, was a mask of stoic composure, but his eyes held a depth of sorrow that mirrored her own. She waited for him to speak, to offer condolences, to ask for the truth, to say something, anything. But he remained silent, his gaze steady and intense, as if he were reading the entire history of her suffering in the lines of her face. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that was somehow more intimate than any words could ever be. Finally, she broke it, her voice a dry rasp. "Why are you here?" she asked, the words barely a whisper. He looked at the single, grimy window high on the wall, where the faintest hint of gray was beginning to dilute the blackness of the night. "They will hang you at dawn," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a shared and terrible truth. She gave a slight, bitter nod. "I know." He turned his gaze back to her, and the intensity in his eyes seemed to burn through the shadows. "I will take your place," he said. The words were so simple, so devoid of drama, that for a moment they made no sense. They hung in the air between them, an impossible, absurd proposition. Ilara stared at him, searching his face for some sign of madness, some cruel joke, but there was nothing. Only a profound, unwavering seriousness. "What?" she managed, the word catching in her throat. You can't." "I can," he replied, his voice still low and even. "Sheriff Miller is a practical man. The town wants a hanging. They want a conclusion. The details are less important than the spectacle." He was right. She knew he was right. The town didn't care about justice. They cared about fear, and they cared about putting that fear to rest with a public violent act. But this was an insanity beyond comprehension. "Why?" she asked again, her voice shaking now. "Why would you do this?" Kyle didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. A flicker of some old, deep-seated pain crossed his features. "Because I know what it is to be judged by men who have no right to be your judge," he said, the words heavy with a history she couldn't fathom. "And because a debt must be paid." Sheriff Miller listened from the hallway, his initial irritation curdling into a knot of disbelief and a strange, unwelcome flicker of opportunity. He couldn't make out the words, only the low, intense murmur of Kyle's voice and the woman's choked replies. He'd expected a prayer, perhaps, a final confession. Not this. Not a negotiation. When Cale stepped out of the cell, closing the door gently behind him, the sheriff's hand was already resting on the butt of his pistol. "Your 5 minutes are up," he said, his voice hard. Kyle faced him, his expression unreadable as ever. "I have a proposal for you, Sheriff." Miller scoffed. "I'm not in the mood for proposals from—" He trailed off, the insult dying on his lips. There was something in the Apache's eyes that wasn't defiance, but a cold, hard certainty that gave him pause. "I will confess," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to shake the very foundations of the jailhouse. "To the rustling. The herds taken from the Miller and Cartwright ranches over the last 2 years." The sheriff's jaw went slack. Those unsolved rustlings had been a constant source of pressure from the territory's most powerful men, a black mark on his record. He'd had no leads, no suspects, only the mounting anger of ranchers who saw him as incompetent. "You?" Miller said, suspicion warring with a rising tide of greedy relief. "You've been stealing our cattle?" Kyle gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will sign a full confession. I will tell you where to find the hides, enough to satisfy everyone. In return, the woman goes free." The proposition was audacious. It was illegal. It was a complete perversion of the law he was sworn to uphold. And it was a perfect solution. A hanging was a hanging. The town would get its pound of flesh, its cathartic release. He could close the books on the rustling cases, earning the gratitude of the powerful ranchers who held his career in their hands. He could present it as a triumph of justice. Not only had he captured a notorious thief, but in a moment of mercy, guided by the hand of God, he had uncovered evidence that exonerated the condemned woman. He could be both a hero and a saint. The hypocrisy of it was staggering, a mountain of lies built on a foundation of convenience, but in the dim light of the jailhouse, it looked a lot like salvation. Cale stood by the window, his back to the sheriff, looking out at the dawning light. The gray was turning to a soft, bruised purple over the mountains, the color of a fresh wound. As Miller scrambled to find paper and ink, his mind already spinning the web of deceit he would present to the town, Kyle let his thoughts drift back. Not to cattle or confessions, but to another dawn, 15 years earlier. He remembered his younger sister, Nita. Her name meant bear in their tongue, and she had been just as fierce, just as full of life. She had a laugh that could startle birds from the trees. He remembered the white trapper who had taken a liking to her, a man with pale, watery eyes and a smile that never reached them. The man's interest had been an ill omen, a shadow falling over their family. The law, the white man's law, had called it a misunderstanding. They had called her death an accident. They had believed the trapper's lies over the grief-stricken words of her family. Kyle had been young then, full of a rage so hot it felt like it would melt his bones. But his rage had been powerless against their laws, their judges, their neatly printed falsehoods. He had been unable to save her. He could not bring her justice. All he could do was carry her memory, a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Over the years, the hot rage had cooled into a permanent, aching sorrow, a solitude that was more than just living alone. It was the loneliness of a promise broken, of a protector who had failed. When he had first heard the whispers about Alara, about the pillar of the community and his quiet, haunted wife, he had recognized the familiar chill. He saw the same story playing out, with different faces, different names, but the same suffocating injustice. He saw Nita's ghost in Alara's eyes when they'd met across that dusty street. He saw the same cage, built of whispers and expectations, and a man's quiet cruelty. He could not save his sister, but he could save this woman. It was not a choice. It was a duty, a debt to a ghost. He would not let another woman be consumed by the town's hollow version of justice. This time he would stand in the way. The scratching of the sheriff's pen was the only sound in the office. It was the sound of a lie being given the weight of law, of one life being traded for another on a ledger of convenience. Alara was brought out of the cell, her steps unsteady. The shackles were removed from her wrists, the cold metal leaving angry red marks on her skin, a faint echo of the brand her husband had left on her soul. She looked from the sheriff's face, slick with a disturbing kind of satisfaction, to Kyle, who stood waiting with an impossible calm. The signed confession lay on the desk between them, the ink still wet. It was a fiction, a piece of paper that would murder a man and set her free. The exchange was a silent, solemn ceremony. As the deputy led her toward the front door, another guard took Kyle by the arm, guiding him toward the cell she had just vacated. For a moment, their paths crossed. They stopped, less than an arm's length apart. The air crackled with the enormity of what was happening. Her freedom felt like a lead weight in her stomach. "I don't even know your name," she whispered, realizing the absurdity of it. He was giving her his life, and she didn't even know his name. "You do," he said, his voice soft. "It's Cale." Her mind flashed back to that day in the mercantile, the name whispered with suspicion by the other townsfolk. Cale, the Apache, the outsider. There were no words for the gratitude, the horror, the profound, earth-shattering guilt that washed over her. "Thank you," was a hollow, meaningless phrase. "I'm sorry," was an insult to the magnitude of his sacrifice. So she said nothing. She only looked at him, her eyes conveying the entire chaotic symphony of her heart. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of understanding, of acceptance, perhaps even of peace. In his eyes, she did not see a victim. She saw a warrior who had chosen his battlefield. The cell door clanged shut behind him, the sound sealing their pact. The deputy nudged her toward the exit, toward the dawn, toward a life she hadn't earned and didn't know how to live. Each step was a betrayal. Each breath of free air was stolen from his lungs. The sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and red, the colors of blood and fire. A crowd had gathered in the town square, a dark clot of humanity drawn by the promise of a spectacle. They stood bundled in coats and shawls, their breath pluming in the cold morning air. There was a grim, almost festive energy humming through them, the kind of nervous excitement that precedes a storm or a sermon. The town priest was there, his face a mask of pious solemnity, ready to commend a soul to the afterlife. The gossips were clustered together, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. They had all come to see the sinner punished, to witness the final act in the cautionary tale of Alara Finch. They had come to see a woman hang. When Sheriff Miller led the condemned from the jailhouse, a ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Murmurs turned into audible questions. This wasn't the pale, slight woman they had been expecting. This was Cale, the Apache rancher, a man they had ignored, feared and dismissed but never truly seen. He walked with his head held high, his steps even and sure. He did not look at the crowd, at their shocked and bewildered faces. His gaze was fixed on the distant mountains, a silent communion with the land that was his only true home. The sheriff, standing on the gallows platform, cleared his throat and read from a piece of paper, his voice booming with false authority. He spoke of new evidence, of a last-minute confession, of a shocking turn of events that had revealed the true culprit behind years of hardship. He spoke of justice, of mercy, of the unerring wisdom of the law. It was a masterful performance, a lie so grand and audacious that the crowd, desperate for a simple narrative, began to accept it. Their initial confusion curdled into a new, simpler kind of anger. The woman had been a tantalizing mystery, a fallen angel. This was just an Indian, a thief. The object of their bloodlust had changed, but the bloodlust itself remained, easily redirected. The irony was a bitter pill. They had come to watch a woman pay for a crime of passion, and now they would watch a man pay for crimes against property. No one questioned it. No one cared. They had their spectacle. That was all that mattered. Hidden in the deep shadows of an alleyway across the square, Alara watched. She was a ghost at her own funeral, a spectator to the sacrifice that was buying her life. Every cheer from the crowd, every self-righteous nod, was a fresh stab of guilt. She clutched the rough brick of the wall, the grit biting into her palms, the pain a small, inadequate penance. She could not look away. She owed him this. She owed him her witness. The priest finished his prayer, his words hollow and meaningless, swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. The executioner, his face hidden beneath a grim hood, placed the rope around Cale's neck. Cale did not flinch. He did not tremble. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if memorizing the feeling of the wind on his skin one last time. When he opened them, his gaze swept over the crowd of hostile faces, over the town that had condemned him, and then, as if by some invisible thread, his eyes found the alley. They found her. He saw her. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. There was only the two of them, connected across that space by a silent, terrible understanding. There was no accusation in his eyes. There was no blame. There was only a profound and final farewell. It was a look that said, "Live. Live for both of us." The sheriff gave a sharp, definitive nod. The sickening thud of the trapdoor opening echoed through the square, a sound that would be seared into Alara's memory for the rest of her days. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by an unnerving silence. Alara's own breath caught in her throat, a sob tearing its way up from the deepest part of her. It wasn't a cry of relief. It was a cry of pure, undiluted grief. The cost of her freedom was this. The cost of her life was his death. The sun, now fully risen, cast a long, dark shadow from the gallows, a finger pointing across the town, accusing them all. But the weight of that shadow fell only on her. It was her burden now, her cross to bear for whatever time she had left. A year passed. The seasons turned, washing the plains in the green of spring and the gold of autumn. The town of Redemption went on with its life, the memory of the hanging fading into local legend, a story told over whiskey to frighten newcomers. They did not speak of Alara. They did not speak of Cale. They had their conclusion, and they were content with the lie. But Alara was not in Redemption. She had walked away from that town and had never looked back. She now lived on his ranch, the remote plot of land on the edge of the world that had been his sanctuary. She had found his small, sturdy cabin, a place built by his own hands, smelling of cedar and wood smoke. It was a hard life. The wind was a constant, scouring presence. The earth was stingy, giving up its sustenance only with a fight. The silence was absolute, a vast, ringing quiet that was deeper than any she had ever known. She worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending to the small herd of horses he had left behind, drawing water from the well. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. Her face was tanned and weathered by the sun. She had, in a way, become him. She was living the life he had left behind, not out of guilt, but out of a fierce, solemn duty. This land was his legacy. His memory was in the cry of the hawk circling overhead, in the strength of the ancient junipers that dotted the landscape, in the silent, stoic beauty of the mountains that held his gaze in his final moments. His sacrifice had not given her happiness. It had given her something more profound, more lasting. It had given her purpose. Late one evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in the same fiery colors as that terrible dawn, she stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the vast expanse. A single tear, hot and silent, traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow, not anymore. It was a tear of gratitude, of remembrance. He had taken her place on the gallows, and in return, she had taken his place on this earth, a lonely guardian of a lonely land, keeping a silent promise to a ghost.